Hello, my name's Adam. This is going to be a short introduction to animating in Photoshop for the Adobe Generation course. So a few versions back, Adobe actually introduced basic animation functionality into the Photoshop program. Now, a number of talented independent animators have already started using this functionality within Photoshop and are producing beautiful work with it. Some of them have produced some really useful tutorials in the video format, some are written. So kudos to those animators, and we'll pop their links in the description. So we thought we'd make a fast and dirty tutorial on making an animation in Photoshop. In this instance, it's going to be more of an abstract, kind of colourful, splodgy mess, as you see on the screen here. Right, I'm going to turn off a palette at the bottom of the screen that you guys don't have just yet. And so to begin, we'll start with a fresh document by going to File and New. And for our preset, we're going to go to the Film and Video section. And I would recommend starting with something like HDTV 720p, which gives us a pixel dimensions of 1280 by 720. Bigger resolutions and smaller resolutions are available. I find this a great size for viewing on the web. Still works great on your own TVs at home or in presentations at schools. If you want bigger, you can go bigger with 1080p, which is full HD. Just bear in mind that your file size will almost double when you do that. So it might make it difficult to stream it correctly over the web. So 720p, okay. Now we need to open our timeline within Photoshop. That's the area of the screen that allows us to control and preview our animations that we're going to be making. So let's go to Window and right down to Timeline. And here we go, we've got a timeline down here. And what we need to do is click on Create Video Timeline. So the layers in my timeline correspond to the layers over here on the right hand side in my layers palette. Of course, animation is made up of a sequence of images which are played back at such speed that they create the illusion of motion or movement. In the UK and parts of Europe, the TV system plays back images at 25 frames per second, and in the US and parts of Asia it's near enough 30 frames per second. So I'm going to go over to the timeline palette, which is in the top right hand corner of the timeline, and select Set Timeline Frame Rate, and I'm going to change that, which is set to the US system, to 12.5 frames per second. And you see that layer has shrunk in size here. What I need to do is use this tool at the bottom to zoom in and stretch out our timeline so we have much more fine control over it. Now our regular Photoshop layers, such as our background layer here, is useful for persistent images that will appear in our animation. So if I make a brush mark, as I scroll through my animation, it persists throughout the animation. So our background layers are useful as background images to our animations. So a desert for Wile E. Coyote to run across, that kind of thing. You can also use photographs. You can bring in textures and things you created in Photoshop before. Anything that you can create in Photoshop can be used as a background for your animation. I'm just going to keep mine flat white though, so we can concentrate on the animation. But what I am going to do is create one extra layer. So I'm going to go to the layers palette and create a new layer. I can also create a new layer by going up to Layer at the top of the screen and New and Layer. And what I'm going to do with my fresh transparent layer is just to draw a quick guide of where I want my animation to happen within the screen, the path that I would like my animation to follow. So I'm making a simple square, rough square, and maybe a kind of swirly squiggle that will move into the square. Because we're making an abstract animation, I just want some shapes that my own animated shapes are going to follow around the screen to keep me on track. So this is the pattern I've chosen. You guys can choose something else that suits you. And then I'm going to change the opacity right down to something like 10 or 15, just so it's still visible, but it's not hindering anything I'm going to be drawing on the screen. Now to animate, we have to create a special kind of layer. So we have to create a video layer. We do this by going up to Layer and down to Video Layers, and we pick New Blank Video Layer. There we go. So a fresh layer has appeared over here in my Layers palette, and it has a little film strip icon. I'm going to make life a little easier and just call it Animation Layer 1, and I'm also going to name my guide layer as Guide Layer. Back in the Timeline palette, which is at the top right hand corner of the Timeline palette, we are going to enable Timeline shortcut keys, and back in there again we're going to enable something called onion skins. Now you'll see what these two functions do when we begin animating. Lastly, just make sure you're working on the right layer. At the moment my guide layer is selected, which is going to help me plan my animation. I want the animation layer selected when I work on it. So I'm going to pick up my brush tool over here and get a nice red colour. And I'm going to create a shape that begins at the start of this guide squiggle I made. It'll grow over time and then diminish to nothing. Just make sure your playhead is at the very beginning of your animation. So let's make our first mark here. And I'm going to use the right cursor key, because remember we enabled those shortcuts, and the right cursor key allows me to advance the playhead one frame at a time. I can use the left cursor key to go backwards, and you also see as I'm moving the playhead forward and making more and more marks that there's a ghosting effect appears, showing where my previous blob, animated blob, is. So I can work out the timings roughly in my head and pace things out so things go faster and things go slower. That's the onion skin effect that we activated in the Timeline palette. So I'm using these cursor keys to push me forward frame at a time through my animation and make these simple marks. We're going to speed up some of this process now, so you get to see how the animation forms. We'll be creating new animation layers. Remember, go to Layer and Video Layers and New Blank Video Layer to do that. Now we can play back our animations by scrolling back to 0, and let's turn off onion skins, and by pressing the spacebar, and that'll loop back over and over again. Now our animation is 5 seconds long at the moment. I'm going to cram it down to 3 seconds, which is this mark here where it says 03. So I'm going to pull back each clip Now very quickly we can build up quite complex animations. I can revisit these shapes, add more complex things happening to them. I can create new animation layers over here, new video layers, and build up more interesting shapes on the screen. So within a short amount of time we can build something that's quite complex and striking. So to go back to my original animation I began with the title, which has a few things going on there, and I've repeated some of the video layers, such as this red shape here. It's also repeated over here, but it's just out of sync with itself. Now if we want to export this and create a video, we'll go to File and Export and then Render Video, and it'll ask us to select a title, so Fast and Dirty Animation seems appropriate, and a place to save that animation to. I'm going to save it onto the desktop, and we're going to set the render settings quite quickly here. I don't want to go into too much detail. We're going to keep some of these defaults. H.264 is a great format for compressing things to quite small size while retaining quite a high quality. If you want a full quality version, go with QuickTime and go to uncompressed. Now that might result in quite a big file size if it's a long duration piece. This isn't, so we're okay. However, if you're saving stuff for the web, quite often websites like YouTube or Vimeo might ask you to save your file as H.264 high quality. So we'll do that, and we'll change the frame rate to 25 frames per second, which is the UK, the usual frame rate in the UK. Right, we'll keep everything else the same, and we're going to hit render. So this will take a small amount of time, and we'll be left with a perfect video on our desktop. All that's left to do is save your animation. So save it so you can come back at a later time and adjust it or add more to it. So go to Save As, and let's give it a name. Animation test, and save. So that's it. I hope you've enjoyed this session showing you the capabilities of Photoshop and how to make a quick, simple abstract animation. Remember to check out those links of different tutorials by great animators out there, and I hope you enjoy making your own animation.